Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Developing Android Apps with Xojo webinar. I'm Geoff Perlman. I'm the founder and CEO of Xojo, and with me is Paul Lefevre. He is one of our esteemed engineers, and I can actually say that I think this is 100% true, that Paul knows more about the Xojo Android framework than anyone else on planet Earth. Would you say that's true, Paul?
Unfortunately, that probably is a true statement. Yes.
Okay. So he is here with me, and he's going to be helping out, answering some questions. If you have questions during the webinar, put them in the Q&A panel in Zoom. If they are more general, then we'll probably wait till the end of the session, and then we'll have a Q&A section, then answer some of those. If they're more detailed, then Paul may answer them privately, and we'll go from there. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, I want to remind you that our Android support in R2 is considered beta. We say that because that means it's not entirely complete and not like anything ever really is, right? We're always improving things. But we want to kind of set expectations. When we have a big new platform that we add to Xojo, we often call it beta, not always, but often. When we, for example, when we developed the new version of our Mac support, Mac framework, using the Cocoa API, we called that beta. When we added 64-bit support in the first release of that, we called it beta. So we're just doing that to set expectations. If you don't have an Android device, it's a good idea to get one for testing. The emulator is great, but you really don't want to ship anything without testing on actual hardware. And there's lots of devices out there. They range in price and quality, and you get what you pay for. But a good middle of the road device is the one I got. It's the TCL 40 XL. It was about $170 on Amazon, and it's running the latest version of Android, so that's great. Seems like a pretty good device, nice big screen, works, it's fast, that kind of thing. But like with any kind of testing, you want to think about your audience and think about what kind of devices they have or what sort of devices you're going to require. Again, that runs the gamut, between from people shipping apps to the public versus apps that are being written, if you're a consultant, for example, or maybe you work inside an organization where you might have a little more control over what devices are in use. So just keep that in mind. All right, so Android Studio is going to be required in order for you to do anything, really. You're not going to use it, but you're going to need to have it installed. You can download it. Just search for Android Studio if you haven't already. Download and install it. I'm going to switch over to it briefly here. Oh, that's the emulator. There we are. Okay, so there's not much you have to do in Android Studio itself. In fact, the latest versions create an emulator for you. If you have an older version you want to update, because I believe that the new versions have a default emulator, but otherwise you'll need to create one. There's instructions in our documentation on how to do that, but it mostly involves launching Android Studio, creating a project. You don't have to save it or anything or do anything with the project. And then you go to the Tools menu and you choose Device Manager. And that will display this pane over here, the Device Manager pane. From there, you can click Create Device, and this walks you through configuring an emulator. Now, again, the newest ones have one, but you may want to set up an emulator that's a little different than the default emulator. While your Android apps will run on any of these things, they're all still really phone apps at this point, so just pick phone. And then the next thing you want to do is pick one of the devices. Now, we recommend that you pick one that has the little Play Store icon in the Play Store column. So when you look down, most of them do, or many of them do anyway. So just make sure you're picking one of those. And this will give you some information on it. Then you click Next, and it's going to pick the most current version of the operating system, the system image to download. If these are disabled like they are down here, that means they haven't been downloaded. That's not super obvious, but there is a download button next to each one. So just click that to download it, and then move on to the next screen. And here you can give it a name. You may want to shorten the name because this name, I believe, appears in the IDE. And the last thing about this screen is that if you're going to be deploying, or rather testing, a lot of apps in the emulator or some very large apps, you probably want to go to this Show Advanced Settings button, scroll down until you get to internal storage, and you may want to bump up this number because the emulator has this much storage and you could run out. And I don't think there's a way to resize it. So you may have to just create another emulator at that point. But if you have a lot of apps, you may want to bump this up a bit. And then you finish and it creates the emulator. If you're going to do on-device debugging, then you go to the device manager and click on physical, and then you click pair using Wi-Fi, or you can pair with a USB cable, not pair, but debug with a USB cable. So there's my device, and pairing with Wi-Fi and debugging with Wi-Fi actually works pretty well, and it sure is convenient to not have to pull a cable out every time. Paul, do you use Wi-Fi, or are you plugging in with USB?
I mostly am using USB just because it keeps the phone charged, which is nice.
Oh, right.
Um,
Yeah, that's convenient. I hadn't thought about that, but
yeah, it's probably a little faster too versus Wi-Fi.
Okay. Well, either way works pretty well. And again, we have instructions. If you go to our documentation, so you don't have to like remember all of this. If you go to our documentation and you go to topics and you go to Android, there's information on installing Android Studio and configuring it. We've got removing if you need to, publishing to the Google Play Store, what's involved in that. You can, with Android, you can give the user a URL and they can download an app directly to their device. And then if you scroll down to debugging under topics, we have an Android section here as well. And we have information on how to debug with the emulator versus on device. So lots of good information in the documentation. All right, I'm going to quit out of Android Studio now. Let's go back to Xojo. Okay, so in this webinar, what we want to talk about are the things that about developing for Android that are similar to how you're used to in Xojo and how they're different. Some of the similarities to iOS and how it's different. Obviously, our goal is to make it so that it's as much like the experience you're used to having, whether it's developing for Android, the web, desktop, doesn't matter. We want that development experience to be as common to those as we possibly can make it. That's always the goal. All right, so of course you can develop for Android on running the Xojo IDE on Mac, Windows, and Linux, which is really nice. So that's a great thing. At this point, Android and iOS projects are separate projects. That won't always be the case, but that's the way it is right now. You can still share all of your classes. So if you have classes that you're using, those can be shared between the two projects, but you'll still have to have two projects for the time being. Android and iOS, in my experience, are more similar than they're different, but we're going to talk about some of the differences. They both use the mobile prefixed classes, mobile application, mobile screen, mobile button, mobile text field, etc. They use those. Most of the class members, and certainly the important ones, are supported on both iOS and Android. You'll find some that are not. If you find some that seem like they probably should be, like they exist for Android, but they don't seem to be supported, chances are we just haven't got to them yet. So just keep that in mind. Now, there are two big exceptions where Android and iOS are different. And that's one is with tables. iOS has iOS mobile table and Android has Android mobile table. Now, the core of these is the same. I mean, you add rows, you remove rows, that sort of thing. But iOS has some very iOS specific functionality in terms of swiping and things like that. And then Android has some unique Android functionality as well. But the core of how you operate with them is very similar. Having said that, eventually, we plan to have a shared table that you can use for both Android and iOS. So we'll eventually get to that. But for the time being, the table, which is a pretty popular control in mobile apps, is going to be different for iOS and Android. Now, the other one that's different are tabs. On the iOS side, you create tabs in an iOS layout and you put different screens on those on the different tabs on an iOS layout. That's not how it works in Android. In Android, we have an actual tab control that you drag out, and you set it up just like a tab panel on a desktop or a web app. So yeah, so that's a difference as well. Now, in Android, you have screens, and there are, as you do in iOS, but in Android, there's no layout object. There's just the screen. So that's another difference between iOS and Android. Frankly, in this case, I think Android's a little easier than iOS is. Another difference is that, and again, this is something that you might be used to if you're doing desktop and web projects. For Android, you have support for implicit instances. I can say screen1.show, screen2.show, that sort of thing. And in fact, that is what is supported, meaning you cannot declare a variable as being an Android screen and then call show. You need to actually use the implicit instances. That is what is supported. And if you want to hear the background on why that is, Paul's going to have a seminar or webinar rather next month that is going to do a deeper dive into the sort of technical details. Android under the hood is very different from any other platform we've ever supported. And having talked to the engineers, mostly Paul, about that, I really appreciate the work that he's done and that Travis has done to make Android work so much like what we're used to in Xojo as it does. But anyway, implicit instances are how it works. iOS, on the other hand, doesn't support implicit instances yet, but we do plan to add that so you can have the same experience on both. Another difference is that you cannot call a method of another screen in Android. So if I'm on screen 1, I can't call a method of screen 2 and return a value. So you can't use a function. And I'm talking about your methods. So just keep that in mind. Now, I ran into a situation where I needed that, and there is an easy workaround. It doesn't actually come up that often, as it turns out. But if you need to call a method of another screen and get a value back, the best thing to do is just put a property on that other screen and have the method populate the property. So then the first screen can call the second screen, call the method, and then access the property after calling the method to get the value. And this is a limitation in terms of how the innards of Android actually work. Yeah, so keep that in mind. Now, in terms of laying out controls, this is one where I actually think Android is much nicer than iOS. In Android, you lay out controls pretty much the way you do for desktop and web, and you use control locking, which is really handy. iOS uses constraints, and constraints can be very, very powerful, but they're also very, very complex, or they can become complex very quickly. And what we have found is that control locking does the job nearly all the time really, really well. And for those occasional times where it doesn't, it's, we've all written code to reposition a control or make something wide or, change things on layout. Writing a couple lines of code for the unique situation where control locking doesn't do the job is really worth it to be able to use control locking everywhere. So that's one thing I really appreciate about Android. We're eventually going to be introducing control locking for iOS. Constraints won't go away. They'll still be there for you to use at runtime, so you'll be able to apply constraints in code. But we feel like control locking is definitely a much better experience. And it sounds like, from what I've heard, Apple pretty much agrees with that, for what it's worth. They seem to be moving away from constraints as well. Let's talk about tablets. So this is, again, beta, and we don't really have tablet support at this point. Your Android apps will run on Android tablets, so I don't want to give you the wrong impression. But unlike iOS, we don't have a way for you to, in the layout editor, say, okay, show me this on a tablet. And I don't think we have a way for you to detect that you're on a tablet either. So you're pretty much building a phone app, but they will run on any Android device. Before the webinar started, Paul and I were talking about all the different devices you can run an Android app on, and there are just so many. Basically, if it runs Android, it'll run an Android app written in Xojo. So bear that in mind. In terms of debugging, we talked about this a bit earlier. There's the emulator, and then there's on-device debugging. Let me just add a line of code here really quick. Let's see if our I is integer, I equals 1. We'll put in a breakpoint. All right, so I'm going to hit run here, and the emulator is going to come forward after it compiles. And you'll see this little app. I've got it up here in the corner, the Xojo Android bridge. This is a Xojo app that basically acts, well, as the bridge between the IDE and the emulator. So here's the emulator running. And, just like you're used to in any other project, you click the button and you're debugging. So it works pretty much the same. And this is true whether you're using the emulator or you're doing it via USB cable, for on-device or via Wi-Fi on-device. It works the same way each time. It does take a little longer for it to run to get into the debugger, but otherwise it does work quite well. So if you need instructions, again, on setting up the emulator or setting up on-device debugging, all of that is in our documentation. There's step-by-step instructions. So it's really pretty simple to set up.
Jeff, if I can jump in, because there was a fun question that was asked, is Jason asked if our Android a watch. And I'll be honest, I don't know about the watch. We've tried TVs and tablets and Chrome devices and Fire tablets and things, but we've not tried a watch. I wouldn't be very hopeful that it would work on a watch, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, I will tell you, and of course, iOS and Android under the hood are very different. But on iOS, and most people aren't, I think they just haven't thought about it. If you have an Apple Watch, nearly all of the apps on your Apple Watch are really just an extension of an app you have on your phone. In other words, from the developer's point of view, in their project, they create an Apple Watch essentially like interface, and then that part just runs on the watch. You can build iOS, or rather Apple Watch apps that only run on the watch, but those are pretty rare. So I would expect Android watches would be the same way, where it's a part of an existing app that's running on the Android device. And if that's the case, then Paul, I think they wouldn't run. But if anyone has a Android watch and wants to test that, let us know. We probably need to buy one and do some testing to find out ourselves. But I would love to see us support watches at some point. Okay, in terms of building, if you're going to copy files, if you're going to have a copy files build step, then what you want to do is make sure that step comes before the build step. So, for example, if I'm going to, where'd my copy files go? Okay. Paul, where's my build step? I thought I'm drawing a blank here. I thought it has to come before the build step, but I don't actually see the build step.
You should be able to just drop it on top of Android and it would add it.
Oh, there it goes. Yep. Okay. So it needs to be before the build step, not after. Keep that in mind. I think that's a difference with iOS. I think with iOS, it happened, you do it. Yeah, on iOS, you do it after the build step. So on Android, you want to do it before. Now, you need to sign your app just like you do for iOS. And when you're signing it, let's go back here. If you're going to build for the Play Store, set that up. But basically, signing involves using this key store properties field. And you basically need to create a signature file. It's a key store file. And I did a video on this, so you can go find it on YouTube and watch it, or get the instructions out of our documentation. But it basically is a file that has a bunch of data in it that identifies you. And you drop that in here. You can, depending on what kind of work you do, you can create it once and you keep using it over and over. If you create, if you primarily create commercial apps that are for like the Play Store, you probably would make sense to just have one of those and use it over and over. if you're a consultant and you create apps for other companies where they're going to be the sort of developer of record, like in the Play Store, it's going to be their information. I would recommend that you create a key store file for each one of them rather than use your own. And those are, again, they're very easy to set up. It's not really a big deal. And once you have them set up, you just select the file here and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's very straightforward.
If I could just jump in, Geoff,
yeah.
there, I wanted to remind people too that one of the benefits of Android is you don't have to distribute your apps through the Play Store.
Correct.
You can distribute them yourself. You can put them on your own website for download. People can just download and install them directly on the device. You can even just drag and drop apps to the device or to the emulator or whatever. So that's a nice little feature, side loading, that I hear rumors that Europe may force Apple to allow that on some iOS apps, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, and keep in mind, if you're going to be side loading, if you're thinking about doing that, that works best in an organization where you have kind of direct contact with your users, because they have to set up their phone to allow it. So, and that can look kind of scary when they do it. So it's not something where you want to sell a commercial app that way. But if you're building an internal app, it's absolutely convenient to be able to do that. Okay. Now, if you really want to dig into the details of where, by class, where Android's different from iOS, we actually have a document we put together. Let me get to it here. So you can download this from our documentation. It's a PDF, and it basically goes through everything and shows you, there's an iOS column and an Android column, and you can see what's supported on each one, and it's color coded. So like the red is iOS, the green is Android, and this can be really handy. I think this is a good idea to download and just give it a quick review, because there will probably be things that are important to you and the kind of development you do that'll stand out. Now, again, keep in mind, this is going to be an ever-changing thing, and some of these things are things that are going to change, soon, like a back button, for example. Paul just recently added that for the next release. So right now you can't have a back button on an Android app, but you'll be able to in the next version. Keep in mind, with the back button, users are used to using the universal back button on a lot of devices. So it's not as common, but I think it's becoming more common for there to be back buttons. But anyway, point is you can scroll through this and you can see what's iOS specific and what is supported on Android. Some of these things like constraints, obviously you're not going to have those on Android, that kind of thing. But this is a big document, it's very long. I'm not going to scroll through the whole thing, but you can kind of go through this and see what's what. Some classes, if you notice they're missing features from, they're there for iOS but not Android, it's probably that they weren't absolutely necessary for a first release. And so, they'll be coming in a future release. So don't worry about that. And that document also contains a list of things not supported for Android yet at all. So keep that in mind. Long term, our plan is to have a single project. I mentioned this earlier, a single mobile project, just like we do for desktop, basically. For both Android and iOS, and for you to be able to just check, I want to build for Android, I want to build for iOS, hit build and get them both. Basically the same kind of experience that you're used to having for the desktop. Eventually a single mobile table, as I mentioned earlier. And our goal is always to give you everything you need. So we're not going to dumb down the mobile table. We're going to have a mobile table that just combines, everything into a single table. And if you, there may be certain features that are only for Android, certain features that are only for iOS, but to the degree that it's possible, we try to provide everything on, each platform we support. And again, as I mentioned earlier about control locking, we're going to provide control locking eventually for iOS, but constraints will still be available in code. I personally love control locking. I like control locking even more, having messed with constraints. Again, constraints are extremely powerful. You can do amazing things with constraints, but unfortunately, there's a lot of complexity that comes with that. And I think the complexity outweighs the benefit. So let's get into some questions. Paul, do we have some questions for...
There was only one other question regarding publishing to the Amazon App Store.
Oh, yeah.
Which I did answer. The question was from Oblio was, is a special key or anything needed from Amazon? And at this point, we have not tested Amazon App Store submissions, but my understanding is that you just use your signed app APK or app bundle that you've built with Xojo, and you send that through the Amazon store process. So I don't think you need a separate key. You need a separate account and everything with Amazon, of course. But like I said, we haven't tested that yet. But by all accounts, it should work just fine.
Great. Yeah, that's what I would imagine too. But if there is a key that they need, I'm sure that it's just a question of creating a different key store file and dropping that into the IDE. So if there is something extra, it's probably going to be fairly straightforward to use it. Now, if you have feature requests, make sure you're making them in issues, like always. Again, if you see things where, hey, Android supports this, but it doesn't seem to be available, and it should be because it's a sort of a standard, app thing. Like maybe it's something you use on iOS. Definitely make sure to point those out to us in issues, because we want to make sure that we give you as much coverage as we can on both. So are there any other questions? There was one here. Oh, there's another one from Oblio. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Can a scrolling view scroll a group of controls? I've been playing around with it for a week, very confused about how that works. Paul, have you experimented with that on Android? I would think that would work.
Yeah, the scrollable container uses a container. So you create a container control, put your controls on that, and then in the scrollable area, you assign the container to it, and then it allows you to scroll what's on the container. So that's how that works. I think there's at least 2 examples of that sort of thing included in the example projects with Xojo.
Yeah, so Oblio, make sure you check out those example projects and see where it's different. I don't think I've tried it on Android, but I've tried it on iOS, and it sounds like it works exactly the same on Android as it does on iOS. I mean, it's a container.
Yes, it should be the same. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, Oblio, check out the examples and contact us if you still are running into trouble there, and we'll help you figure that out. Oblio says it's not working for him. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm wondering, Oblio, if you can answer in the Q&A, are you running in the emulator or on a device? That would be helpful to know. But you can contact support, and we'll help you track that down. Jason is asking, you mentioned not being able to call a function from screen 1 to screen 2. Can you maybe show an example of this? Yeah, I can show it real quick. Okay, so let me add another screen. Okay, and let me just put a button on here so I can get back to screen 1. Or actually here, let's do this, and we'll make this button go to screen 2. Okay, screen 2.show, so implicit instance, right? And let's add a method. I'm going to show you how to work around this. So here's our method, my method, and normally it would return a value, and we can't return a value. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a property, and we're going to put the value here. And in the method, I'll just say my value equals 5. Okay, and then what we're going to do is on screen 2, I'm going to say screen 1 dot my, oops, hang on, my method is not public. Okay. Oops, where was I? There we are. Okay, so I'm going to say screen 1 dot my methods. That calls the method, and then I'll do message box screen 1 dot my Oh, my value is also private. There we go. Okay, so basically the method's going to populate this property, right? That's what we did. We made the method populate the property. And then here on screen 2, I can just get my value here, toString, and grab the value. So now when I run this, yep, what happened? Oh, my copy file step. Yep. Okay, let's get rid of that. Okay. So basically, you can call a method of another screen. You just can't return a value. And the reasons for that are very, very complicated. But we've tried many things to make that work, and I don't have a lot of confidence that's ever going to work. So we'll go to screen 2. I click the button, and there's the value. So instead, what we're doing, instead of returning the value, we're simply assigning the value that we would have returned to a property on that same screen. And then from screen 2, we call the method and then just access the property. So that's kind of workaround for a function. You know, when this first came up, I was kind of, I didn't like the fact that you couldn't call a function, but after talking to engineers, they pointed out that just doesn't happen that often, calling a function of one screen from another screen. And often you can just move that function elsewhere, like to a class or a module, and then you can use it just as you expect. So it's not like you can't call a function at all on Android. You absolutely can. It's just you can't call it from one screen to another. Okay, I'm looking here. Is there, oh yeah. So Edwin's asking if you want to detect you're on a tablet, can you just inspect the screen size? That seems like a reasonable way to go. I'm sure it eventually will provide some kind of API, but yeah, I think screen size, and that's honestly, it's usually the most important thing, is just to know how much screen real estate you've got. So that would be a reasonable answer, or a reasonable way to go. Another user is asking, I wonder if there's a possibility to use gestures like pinch to manipulate the view of a picture in an image viewer or scrollable area in Android. Paul, is there any kind of pinch to zoom or any kind of pinching gestures supported yet?
The canvas has some touch things you can detect, but we don't have any specific pinching events or anything like that.
Okay. Jason's asking a follow-up question. Will you need to run code like screen1.close to close out the screen? And if so, what happens if you close the screen and then try to call the function from that screen? Yeah. Well, in this case, we went, in the example I showed, we went from screen 1 to screen 2. So I'm not, you know, if I close, typically these kind of apps are hierarchical. So typically I'm going to close screen 2 when I want to go back to screen 1. I guess they don't have to be. So you could, in theory, close screen 1, but otherwise it's still there. It's just not frontmost. Nick is asking, do you have a commitment from developers like MBS for Android? I know that there are things that people have used on Android from MBS. So I know that the MBS plugins, many of them do work. So I'm not sure what you mean beyond that. I think that Christian Schmidt is pretty good about responding to developer demand. So if developers are asking for things, I'm sure he'll be interested in supplying them. And you know, of course, you can use declares just as you're used to elsewhere. So if you find something you need to call in the Android operating system and it's not there in the Xojo framework, you can call it via declares. And Paul's going to go into declares quite a bit in his webinar next month. So make sure that you show up for that one.
And if I just jump in real quick,
yeah,
we did publish a blog post too the week of the R2 release. Martin, one of our MVPs, did create an open source project called the Android Design Extensions, which is
that's right.
A project containing probably hundreds of declares that allow you to modify various things in Android. So there should be plenty of ways and to extend the initial capabilities that are in Android. And like Geoff mentioned, next month I'll be talking more about how to set up declares, and you can even build your own libraries in Kotlin that you can declare to. So I'll be talking a bit about that as well.
Okay, so Jason's asking another follow-up question. He's asking, what if you close screen one? And to be honest with you, Jason, I've never tried that. So why don't we, I think Paul probably knows the answer, but I'm going to just go ahead and try it. Oh, interesting. Well, let's try again. Or do you think, Paul, that's just going to keep happening?
Yeah, I don't think you can close the screen from another screen. The screen can just close itself.
Oh, okay. Well, there's your answer.
Yeah, and if you did try to call a method on a screen that's not yet open, essentially the way the framework has that is they're put into a queue and then they're called once the screen gets opened.
Oh, okay. Is that another one of those behaviors that's essentially due to the underpinnings of Android's?
Yeah. I maybe I'll feel like talking about that more next month if I have time. But yeah, it's rather complex.
Okay. All right. If we don't have any more questions, we appreciate y'all coming. We'll have another. What's the title of your webinar, Paul?
My webinar is just called a deeper look at Android. And specifically, I will be just giving a brief overview of some of the underpinnings and, how this ended up being implemented, just to give you a kind of a technical, how it's made kind of thing, sharing a little bit of the sausage, so to speak. And then we will talk again a little bit about some of the differences. Probably won't need to talk on those too much since Geoff covered most of them here. And then we'll talk about declares and what you can and cannot declare to, and then how you could create your own library using Kotlin and Android Studio that you can then declare to from Xojo.
That sounds great. Okay, well, again, we appreciate y'all coming. We'll keep doing these webinars every month, so look for the emails about them and make sure you sign up. And if you have an idea for a webinar, some topic you'd like to see us cover, contact us and we will definitely consider it. We do these for you. So we absolutely appreciate your feedback on them. And until next time, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you later.